Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program, Left Behind, the pandemic's impact on special education considerations and the digital divide. My name is Natalia Johnson, and I'm president of the Garden State Bar Association and senior counsel at Johnson & Johnson. We are thrilled to join co-sponsors, Essex County Legal Aid Association, Essex County Bar Association, and Johnson & Johnson for what promises to be an informative program. Before we launch into the substantive portion of tonight's program, I want to share some background information about tonight's sponsors. The GSBA is New Jersey's oldest and largest professional organization for African-American judges, lawyers, and law students. The association seeks to improve the administration of justice and supports initiatives designed to improve the economic condition of all individuals and eliminate discrimination and inequality. And now I will introduce the president-elect of the Essex County Bar Association, Glenn Troublefield. Glenn?
Thank you, Natalia. My name is Glenn Troublefield. I work at Corella Byrne, but I'm privileged to be the president-elect to the Essex County Bar Association. The connection to our Essex County community, is an understatement. It's something that we're all very proud to have. And I want to welcome you to this terrific program. Of course, it's always have to acknowledge our sponsors. And I think with this particular area, Johnson & Johnson, Essex County Legal Society, and the Garden State Bar Association are blazing a trail on what we need to do about addressing the educational issues. We cannot do it without our partners. I want to personally thank each of those entities for doing this. And also want to thank our presenters, Carla Cartwright of Johnson & Johnson, Yvette Gibbons, the Executive Director of the Essex County Legal Association, Mary Frances Palisano, Director of Commercial and Criminal Litigation at Gibbons PC, and also Rebecca Spar of the Educational Law Center. We can't do this without your contributions. And so on behalf of the ECBA, just want to say thank you. And I want to encourage everyone, when you have a chance, to look at the Essex County Bar Association website. You know, being part of the fabric of the community is what we do. And you have information there that can help you from legal aid, as well as just answering any other questions that you may have from this program or others. So Natalia, thank you very much, and congratulations to the Garden State Bar Association. This is a terrific program, and I'm gonna sit back, shut my mouth, and just learn on this very, very special topic. But thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Glenn, and we look forward to future collaborations. So now, without further ado, I wanted to introduce our moderator for the evening, Carla Cartwright, who is Senior Director in Global Digital and Regulatory Policy, Worldwide Government Affairs and Policy here at Johnson & Johnson. Carla leads Global Digital and Regulatory Policy at J&J in the Government Affairs and Policy Group across pharmaceutical, consumer, and medical device sectors. She works on a variety of health equity and R&D policy issues and represents global affairs in several internal and external venues, including Johnson & Johnson Data Science Council. I can go on and on about Carla, but I'll kick it off to her so that she can introduce the panelists and we can launch into our discussion. Carla?
Thank you, Natalia. And I want to again thank all of our sponsors, thank our wonderful panelists, and thank all of you for being here. We know it's a very busy time getting ready for back to school. And so we really appreciate you joining us on this very important topic. So Glenn stole a little bit of my thunder, gave you sort of the titles of our panelists, but I want to tell you just a little bit more about them and the amazing expertise and context that they're going to bring to this conversation. So I'm going to start with Yvette, who is the Executive Director of Essex County Legal Aid, but she is also on the District of New Jersey's mediation panel, an arbitrator for the New Jersey State Board of Mediation, and has served as a federal arbitrator for the District of New Jersey. She has considerable experience not only in the arbitration and litigation avoidance fields, but also in employment law. And she counsels clients regularly in wrongful discharge avoidance and compliance with important laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Family and Medical Leave Act, the Equal Pay Act, and civil rights violations. So Yvette, thank you so much for being here. We are also joined by Mary Fran Palisano, who is director at Gibbons PC, where she co-leads the child advocacy team, which focuses on special education, school discipline matters, and juvenile proceedings. She's the firm's pro bono coordinator and chair of their pro bono committee. And she's consistently named New Jersey Families Magazine's best lawyers for families in the area of special education. She advocates for children who have special needs so that they can obtain the education they need. And this is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So wonderful having you join us. And I'm truly delighted to introduce Rebecca Spar, who is currently a volunteer consultant and advocate on special education matters and with the ELC, as Glenn mentioned. From 1988 to March of 2018, she was a partner with the law firm Cole Schultz, where she had a litigation practice, and she also specialized in education and disability rights law. She represented parents and children in several precedent-setting educational cases, among them students' rights to damages and compensatory education. And I know, Rebecca, we're going to talk a little bit about that and how that has evolved in the pandemic. She's a member of the Board of Trustees of the Education Law Center, and we, again, really value that partnership. And I also just wanted to note that she regularly mentors young attorneys, including through the Volunteer Lawyers for Justice, and provides trainings for pro bono attorneys on how to support and work with parents and caregivers of children with disabilities. So these are our wonderful panelists. And now I just want to give you just a little bit of context on this conversation and why we're here. You saw the title, and it talks about special education, which is obviously a critically important topic for all of our students, but in the context of the pandemic. And you might be wondering, what is this digital divide? Why are they calling that out as a part of this conversation? But as we continue to deal with the COVID pandemic and potentially others, we are going to be dealing more and more with the need for digital technology. And so part of the conversation is around how we help all of our students bridge these educational gaps that many of them have fallen behind during the pandemic, and how that can be especially challenging for students with special needs. So it's not just about having a school district that offers something on Zoom or some online platform, but it's really about, do you have the skills? Is it configured for your abilities? Do you have access? Do you have a place in your home? Do you have Wi-Fi, broadband, the right tools, the confidence to do it? All of those kinds of things. So that's what we want to get into as we talk about the digital divide and whether or not we all have really, truly equitable access to these things to support our children and our communities. So with that, I want to get right into what are we talking about when we talk about special education. So I'd love to start with you, Mary Fran. Who is entitled to special education services? And can you tell us what is this individualized education program, this IEP that people might have heard about? And you're on mute.
Sorry, that's a great question and a great place to start this conversation. So a lot of times when people think about special education, they're not really sure what that means. And of course, there's legal definitions in state and federal law, and that could be a whole program in itself. But we just want to simplify this and give everyone a snapshot of what we're talking about. So under the relevant laws, for special education to be eligible for special education, that's services and related services in the public school district, children between the ages of 3 and 21 need to meet the definition of a child with a disability. Now, of course, that has its own definition. And to make things a little bit easier, a child with a disability can be a child with a cognitive issue, a physical issue, an emotional issue, a learning issue. And in that context, the child needs to fit into a certain category. And to give you a couple examples of a category, it could be other health impaired or a specific learning disability. So, what we're talking about is, for example, ADHD. So that could be a specific learning disability. And a child that has ADHD can be in the category of other health impaired, for example, depending on what the child study team decides, or it could be a specific learning disability category. But anyway, what I don't want the people that are listening today to think is that their child isn't entitled to services if you don't meet this definition, because there's other avenues. There's something called a 504 plan that you can get. And then there's also general education programs. So I think that's really important when talking about, what happened in the pandemic, kids falling behind. There's lots of services available. So it's really important to be an advocate for your child and speak up. And I congratulate everybody who's listening today, because you're taking the first step and getting information about what to do. And there's services that are available, whether you're in the general education or whether you're special education. So, and then just to, kind of like give you a little bit more information about special education. If your child is eligible for special education, there's something called an IEP, or an individualized education plan that's developed. And again, that could be a whole conversation that we have just surrounding that. But that plan lays out the services that a child would get.
Thank you so much. No, so helpful, so much information. And you defined, what is a disability and all of these parameters in terms of age and things like that. But I'd love to turn to you now, Yvette, and kind of pick up on where Mary Fran left off and ask you about the parent perspective and what a parent can do, a parent or a guardian, family member, if you suspect that your child has a disability, and what you can do if you feel like your child's not getting the support they need from their current school.
So I appreciate the introduction that you gave me, but the important thing that was left out for today is that I am a mother of 2 kids. And one of my 2 kids she doesn't anymore, but she did have an IEP. So I am speaking from a purely personal point of view today. I had to go through the entire IEP process. And I am here to tell you that it is a struggle. But the only person who can make sure that their child gets what their child needs and is entitled to in the state of New Jersey is the parent. No one is going to advocate for your child more than you. And along that journey, there will be various people who will attempt to shut you down, because at the end of the day, when the school has to do something different for any child, whether that's to put them out of district or pay for them to go to a private school. It takes money out of that school system. And they're sometimes very reluctant to do that. So my first advice to any parent is you cannot give up. And you may want to, but you have to. The thing that's very unique about having a kid that needs an IEP or some type of special education help is that it doesn't matter what your income level is. I have seen very wealthy people literally break down because of the struggles they're having getting their kid what they need. But they have resources, they have money, they can hire lawyers, so it makes it easier for them. I have lawyer friends who hire lawyers because they can't do the process themselves. If you're lower income, you can go to a Volunteer Lawyers for Justice and Essex County Legal Aid, to Rutgers, who has the Education Law Center, and also to ELC. So there's help for you there too. The people who are hurt is people in the middle class, because you don't qualify for free legal aid. And a lot of the education attorneys want a fairly large retainer. Like I called one, the retainer was $30,000. So, but not only are you going to be your kid's biggest advocate, you will be amazed at the amount of rights that you have. So you have to equip yourself. And they give you this book, and maybe one of the panelists can remember the name of it. I just don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, that tells you all the rights that you have. And it is amazing. So if you don't give up the fight, you can eventually get what your kid needs. And that fight can take years, and it can involve going to court. But I think the first thing you need to know is, does your kid need an IEP? And sometimes the parent will kind of figure out something's a little off center here. And sometimes the school will tell you something is off center here. And they'll have this, I don't know who's going to talk about this. You'll get together and you'll have the meeting with the IEP team, and they're going to have all these suggestions for you. And you're going to literally be in a room with all these experts surrounding you, telling you what they've decided is best for your kid. Remember, you make the final decision about everything. I also highly suggest that you record every meeting you go to. That's allowed. You say, I'm recording, you put the recorder on the table, and you go from there, because things have a tendency to get lost in translation. So I'm sorry, am I on topic? Is that what you want me to talk about?
No, these are great tips. You're totally on topic. This is so
Okay.
helpful.
Now, in terms of the pandemic, now my kid, and I'm not going to really go into much detail because it's not my story to tell, but it was an ADHD problem. The pandemic and Zoom and video in school do not mix well together at all. So there was a whole lot of catching up to do, because think about it, you have ADHD, you can't focus on a video all day. So that was our digital divide issue. But what I've noticed with working in the clinic is that we were fortunate to have internet that didn't go out. But if you are a lower income family, you may not have access to the internet. The internet signal that you have may be weak. You may not have, the only internet equipment you may have is a cell phone, because you may not be able to afford a computer. So your child is going to get further and further and further behind. So now that we've somewhat come out of the pandemic, as a parent, and this is going to be so much more on your shoulders, I totally get it. You now have to go back, do a reevaluation, and make sure your child is where they're supposed to be.
Thank you so much, Yvette, for that perspective and that part of your story and your narrative. You did talk about, the digital divide, the impact during the pandemic. We know that when schools first shut down, lots of families didn't have a Chromebook, didn't have a computer. Maybe you had one, but you have multiple children. Lots and lots of challenges in terms of Wi-Fi, broadband, all of those things. And so, Rebecca, I'd love to turn to you, because we have a constant education gap, right, between children based on socioeconomic factors and all of these things. We've had that for decades. It was exacerbated by the pandemic, and that was for children, whether they were typically developing or have special needs. And so I know you've done a great deal of work around, helping students navigate this pandemic and receive the services that they should receive. So we'd just love for you to speak to, what kinds of things you did during that period, and what we mean by compensatory education for many of the students who've been impacted.
Okay, Thank you. Before I turn to that, I'd like to point, Yvette mentioned the book that gave out the rights of parents, and there are a couple of items on the resource list. The first book is The Parents' Rights in Special Education, which the Department of Education puts together, and that there's a link to that, to the prize in your resource materials. And there's another book which Education Law Center has put together, which is like an overview of special education in New Jersey. And there's a link to that book also on the resource list, as well as links to the New Jersey statutes and regulations and the federal statutes and regulations pertaining to special education. So on
And sorry, Rebecca, sorry, I just wanted to, because you mentioned this resource list and people might be wondering, what is that? How do I get that? So I just wanted to pause and point out that we are going to provide that at the end of the program. So that will be emailed out to everyone who registered. You can also access these materials through the GSBA website, but it will be emailed to everyone who's a part of this webinar. So it's got a great, great set of resources, including this list with lots of links, something that explains all of these acronyms and numbers and things like that. But I just wanted to make sure people knew that that was coming. Thank you, Rebecca.
Okay. So on the impact of COVID on students receiving special education, I mean, I think it's fair to say that COVID had a significant impact on all students, whether they had a disability or not, but it had an even greater impact on vulnerable students, which includes students with disabilities. And some of the reasons for that is initially many students received only paper packets until their schools made the transition to virtual instruction. And in some instances, those paper packets continued for considerable time, even up to a year or more, because the student lacked the devices, the technology, the internet access that they needed. And you can imagine, without a teacher in the home to go through the paper packets with the children, I mean, you're not going to be learning from that. And even when virtual instruction started, in many instances, the student had an IEP, which was going to be supposed to be implemented, but because of timing issues, school districts, many reduced the amount of the service, you know, the duration of the service, the frequency of the related services. Sometimes they recorded the service rather than having an interactive process during the virtual instruction. And as Yvette pointed out, many students with disabilities, some students flourished reportedly under the virtual instruction, but most did not. And students with more significant disabilities definitely had issues. Students with ADHD, students with visual issues, students who had any kind of a distractibility issue usually had difficulty with the constant virtual instruction. And so at the beginning of this process, when COVID first began in March of 2020, both the federal government, Federal Department of Education, and the State Department of Education told school districts that at the end, when school reopens, that schools are going to have to sit down with parents and consider whether or not compensatory services are needed. And so that in some areas has happened, in other areas it has not happened. But anyway, compensatory education services are additional services. It could consist of special education. It could consist of related services that are above and beyond the usual services that are included in the child's IEP. And the aim of compensatory education is to put the child in the place where they would have been had they received the services that they should have received in their IEP. Or in the case of the virtual instruction, it's to put them in the place they would have been had they received the in-person instruction that was called for in their IEPs prior to the COVID coming. So that's basically, and compensatory education services are something that has been available pre-COVID and continues to be available after COVID. I mean, it is a remedy that was found by the courts to be appropriate relief when a student has not had the rights that they should have had under the federal and state statutes and regulations. Now, did you want me to go into what circumstances when a student may be entitled to?
I think so. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
When is a student entitled to those services? And what if the district says that they acted in good faith during COVID, right? Like that they did the best that they could. Does that mean that the child is not entitled to compensatory services because, you know, it was like a public health emergency?
Well, okay, in answer to the first question, if the district says to you, we acted in good faith, we did the best we could, we gave you all the services we possibly could, but we just couldn't do everything that was in your IEP. The federal government already took this into account when COVID started. And when Congress considered its first rescue plan to provide services to schools and others, they asked the Secretary of Education, who was Betsy DeVos at that point, whether they should reduce some of the requirements for providing an appropriate education because of COVID. And they gave her a certain time period to get back to them so that Congress could decide whether they would waive or limit some of those requirements. And Betsy DeVos came back to them and said, no, don't do it. Districts can provide the services. They may have to provide them differently, but there's no need to reduce the requirements of implementing students' IEPs eventually and providing an appropriate education. So school districts have the same obligation during COVID. And the way that the federal government and the state in guidance that they issued dealt with this was by telling districts, yes, we recognize that during COVID, you may not be able to provide all the services or provide them in a way that is as effective to the students. But when school reopens, you need to meet with the parents and consider whether compensatory services are necessary. Now, currently, because of a statute that was passed in the last few months, which extended the statute of limitations for filing compensatory education claims, districts are also required by no later than December 31st, 2022, to hold IEP meetings with every single family, children, every child receiving special education. So any parents that are watching this, you should plan to, and you can request an earlier meeting. You don't have to wait till December 30th to have your IEP meeting, to consider and should begin preparing to consider whether your child needs compensatory education. And families have until September 1st of 2023 to file claims for the time period starting on March 18th, 2020 until September 1st, 2021. So you have time, if the district does not agree to provide some compensatory services, you have time to make those claims. Now, compensatory services are above and beyond what a child needs currently going forward. So if you have an IEP meeting with your district and they agree to provide compensatory services, they can put them, what those services will consist of and what the frequency will be in the IEP. But they're not supposed to replace the services that your child would otherwise get. So they're not going to take away. Most usually, because of timing issues during the day, most students don't have too much spare time during the day. So usually compensatory services can be provided either before school, after school, They can be provided weekends, summer, so it's often occurs outside of the regular school day. And they can be the services that were missed. They can be the services that weren't effective, because you couldn't benefit from virtual instruction. And there are a number of documents in the resource list that you're going to get that give you pointers on, there's a booklet that ELC put together on facts concerning compensatory education services, and it goes through many of the issues, many of the questions that you might have. There's the federal and the state guidance talking about compensatory education services. So there's a lot of.
And I see Yvette that you came off mute. I wanted to let you jump in, please.
So I have a question for either Rebecca or Mary. What happens when a parent disagrees with what the school wants to do? Because that are the classification that the school wants to put the child into. What can a parent do?
Well, a parent, for any time a parent disagrees with what the school district puts into an IEP, or even sometimes when it's not something that's put into the IEP, they can express their concerns. They can ask for an IEP meeting. And I think, the district has to respond within 20 days or schedule the IEP meeting if they request an IEP meeting. If that doesn't resolve it, a parent always has a right to file mediation. They have a right to file due process. Now, mediation is a voluntary process. It's a process that a parent can go to on their own. They don't need to have an attorney. It's nice if you have a friend or you have a relative that kind of goes along to support you, but you can go to mediation. You can go to due process by yourself, but that gets a little more complicated. And all of this is explained in the prize book and in the one on special ed education that ELC put together. And there are forms, there's model forms for filing mediation, filing due process.
One other point that I wanted to make, there's probably a lot of attendees where the children don't yet have IEPs, and that's an important procedure to know about. Of course, in the materials that you'll be getting, it lays it out, but the bottom line is it has to be a written request. And you can put it to the director of special services or the child study team, but you should put it in writing and describe why you think that your child should be evaluated and get into some detail about that. And that will put you in front of the child study team. So I think that's really important because a lot of folks on this Zoom may not yet have a child with an IEP. So I think that's an important piece. And then also, I think another important piece is for parents whose children already have IEPs is, what do you do if your child isn't getting the services that are described in the IEP? And another term that I think needs to be defined, I know I used it, Rebecca used it, related services. So what we mean by related services, it could be speech or OT or PT, occupational therapy, physical therapy. These are the related services that a child would receive pursuant to this IEP plan. And during that, when you're requesting that your child be evaluated, when you're sending in that letter, and again, there's sample letters and some of the material that on that list. So you don't even need to start from scratch. There's sample letters that you can use, and you could do it on your own. You don't need an attorney to do that for you. You can ask for evaluations in the area of speech or OT. It wouldn't only be like an educational assessment, but there's other areas that you can ask for too. So I think that's important too.
So
And
Mary,
OT is occupational therapy, Mary?
Yes.
Great. Sorry, go ahead.
So Mary, I'm not sure, different school districts start at different ages. Some start at kindergarten, some have pre-K4, pre-K3. When should a parent start the process if they think that their child may need an IEP?
So sometimes this starts in preschool, right? And it could be a referral from preschool. The parents can make their referral. And then, you know, so you can get services as early as then. But if you're in kindergarten and you feel and a teacher hasn't approached you or the school hasn't approached you, you should be an advocate like you talked about. Everyone should advocate for their child, email or contact the teacher and say, for example, a child in kindergarten who's not reading. There's issues related to dyslexia. There's other issues that are related to reading that you may want to have, your child evaluated at that point. I always say the earlier, the better, right? The earlier that you get your child services, the better. So as soon as you see something and no one's mentioned anything to you yet, I think that's the time. I have plenty of clients who in preschool are looking into getting services. So it's never too early. It's never too early. And something to note that a lot of times clients come to me and their child's already in 4th grade or 5th grade and they've had an ongoing reading issue. In the public school at 3rd grade, you're really moving from learning to read to reading to learn. So at that point, it's really, of course, anytime you should get services and you should get help, but a lot of times kids are moving on, from reading. So the earlier, the better to get that intervention. And like I said earlier, it's not, if your child doesn't qualify for special education, that doesn't mean that there's not services out there. And a lot of times, these aren't advertised, but there's, sometimes they call it instructional support. It depends on what school district you're in, but there's general education programs that I've seen just in my experience in representing families in New Jersey for reading and math and writing. And if you ask your teacher, your child's teacher, they can let you know like what's available. Some of those services are what they call push in to the classroom. And there may be a group of children in the classroom that are getting extra help as early as kindergarten. And sometimes they're pull out. A lot of times you see like a reading specialist and there's a group of 3 children or so that are getting some specialized instruction. And then other times it may be more obvious to you that your child needs something more special education and these services that children can get. And we haven't really talked about that yet either, but there's all different types of services. And, as we talked about before, there's acronyms for everything. And I believe there's a list on this resource list of acronyms, but there's something called in-class support or in-class resource where your child can get services in the classroom through an IEP. And then there's also pull-out services that it's a resource room or a self-contained classroom, or there's other services. I'm of course a big inclusion advocate and I love, keeping children in the classroom as much as possible. So, definitely ask about these things, look at the website, your school district's websites. A lot of times they have services that are available in special education, but definitely be your child's advocate, ask your teacher, talk to other parents to get the information. A lot of times there's parent groups and things like that. And the earlier, the better.
So,
Mary Fran,
so this also works if you have a kid that's in a non-public school too. They're still entitled to these same.
That's correct. They're entitled to get services.
But
That's a whole nother program. That's a whole nother program we want to
Yeah, I
talk
just
about.
want parents.
And it's a little bit more complicated. But
No, I just wanted their parents to know that, even if your kid is in a private school, they are entitled to benefits, or even if you're in a public school, sometimes you can get that school district to send your kid either to what they call an out of district school or to a private school. So I just wanted parents to know that there are options out there.
so
purely private school where you're paying for the school. It's not a special education approved private school. You're entitled to some services, but you're not entitled to a free appropriate public education. So it's a different thing. There's also 504 services, and in order to get services under IDEA or the special education federal law, you have to need special education. And there are some students who need supports, they need accommodations, but they don't need special education. And those students may be eligible for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is a federal act. So if you find that your child is turned down for an IEP, then certainly, and you feel they need support, then certainly find out who your Section 504 coordinator is in your school and ask for Section 504 services. Now, so that's another option. If they need support, but the district says, well, they don't need special education.
So I just wanted to pause. We've got a couple of questions coming in. So congratulations to those of you who found the Q&A function, and we want to make sure we get to those. And one is, I'm going to go out of order because one is related to kind of what we're talking about right now in terms of getting that evaluation. So the question is, may a parent request a school district to provide a needs assessment, and are they required to provide that evaluation if you ask for it? And I think, Mary Fran, you were talking about you have to make the request in writing, but would love it if you could say more about making that initial request.
Okay. So when you make that request to have your child evaluated, then there's certain evaluations that take place in the public school. And so we're not talking about a, in the initial evaluations. And again, this could probably be a whole program, talking about this, but a public school can certainly do an educational assessment. They can do a speech assessment, OT, PT. If you're talking about like a more with a medical doctor, those are different. A school district can certainly do that type of evaluation too, but that's not generally, it's independent. It's not within the school district. But usually what you see is those evaluations that the school district does, they would say that a child is eligible or not eligible, and a parent may request that. May request that a neurological evaluation or something, more detailed be done, or an independent speech evaluation, or a parent may do that on their own. A lot of times, parents come to me and we have their child evaluated privately, and then we take that report and bring it to the school district and do it that way. So there's a lot of different avenues depending on resources that parents have. And the most important thing is, like I said, to speak up. If somebody hasn't come to you and said that they think your child needs something more, like a instructional support or like a 504, Rebecca mentioned a 504, usually they have the applications right on the school district website. I would say most of them do. And the parent could fill that out. Or if you think that your child needs an IEP, you could write a letter. You could have your child evaluated privately and bring that report to the school district. Those can be a little costly, so it may be cost prohibitive to some parents. But there's different avenues that you can follow in this process.
Mary, with
For-
that,
For the evaluation, if a parent disagrees with a district evaluation, they can request an independent educational evaluation at the district's expense. And what they need to do is it's best to put your request in writing. And you can say, I disagree with the district evaluations, and I'm requesting an independent educational evaluation consisting of, and then you write down what particular assessments you want. Like you want an educational assessment, you want a psychological assessment, a speech, an OT, a PT. And the district has to get back to you and if they don't want to do it, they're supposed to file due process within 20 days. And if they don't, and you do, then you have a very good chance of getting the district to pay for the assessment, the evaluation. So that is something if you can't afford, because private evaluations can be expensive. Sometimes you can get your insurance to pay for them.
I just do have something, because Okay, I
I-
want to
I
turn to
just-
you and then the next question from the audience.
So I just want to add in the real life part of how this works. And just is not just my experience of other, friends of mine. The neurological evaluations, I think that's what they're called. This has been a few years from now. They can be thousands of dollars and you can get the school to pay for them. That's going to be another fight that you have, but again, don't give up. You can, and I know many people have done this, actually get your school district to pay for a private independent school for your kid to attend, not an out of district school. They're two different things. If you can show that that private school will give your child the help that they need. Again, that doesn't come easy. You may end up in court, but you can get it done. So I just wanted to.
Yeah.
know that.
No, it's great to hear the lawyers and the real life. So thank you. We want to hear it all. We do have another audience question. And this is someone who knows all the acronyms. So can schools use federal funds, either IDEA, which is the special education law, or COVID funds to defend against a student's claims for denial of a free and appropriate public education during COVID?
Well, most school districts, to my knowledge, cannot use federal funds ever to pay for attorney fee to defend against providing the education that the federal government wants them to provide. Many districts have insurance policies which may provide insurance counsel to defend against due process and district court, state court actions.
Great, thank you. And now I want to just turn and make sure we get to something really important that you touched on, Mary Fran, inclusion. And you talked a little bit about push in and pull out. And so we just wanted to have a moment for all of you to address, but we'll start with Mary Fran. What if a child does have a cognitive disability? Are there opportunities for that child to be educated with typically developing children? And how can you advocate for inclusion if you feel like that's an appropriate path for your child?
100%. And I think that a lot of parents don't realize this. You know, their child may have a cognitive disability and they think that they can't be educated with typically developing peers. But that is not true. And again, we could have a whole program on this, but what's a really important takeaway is that the laws, in my view, are very favorable for inclusion. So Rebecca mentioned this earlier, a free and appropriate public education, FAPE, you hear it called, that's the acronym. And after that, it's in the least restrictive environment. And you hear it called LRE. So FAPE and LRE, that's kind of the lingo that you hear people talk about. So the least restrictive environment, we're talking about the general education setting. And certainly for education, for elementary age students, a kindergartner, why wouldn't they be in the typically developing peer classroom and learning alongside of the other children? There's services that can be provided. I mentioned something called, and this is just an example, in-class resource. With that program, which a child can get through an IEP, there would be a special education teacher in the classroom, and that special education teacher can modify work. You don't necessarily need that type of program in the classroom, but I personally think that it's helpful for inclusion, and this teacher can work with the general education teacher and modify material. And there's in-class support, there's other programs, and I'm using acronyms, ICS, ICR, but there's push-in programs that make inclusion available. Just because your child can't do the same math that their typically developing peers can do doesn't mean that they should be not in that classroom. And there's a lot of value of having typically developing peers there for vocabulary, behaviors, all these positive things. I can't speak enough about how important it is. And a lot of times there may be a suggestion that a child should be in a self-contained class or pushed out for that small group instruction. And maybe some children need that. And every parent should look at their child and get all the information, listen to all the professionals and decide for yourself. Because sometimes maybe the general education classroom isn't the best fit. But if you think that that's what your child needs, there are services available. So speak up at that IEP meeting. And maybe you're not using the right terminology, but say, isn't there something that could be done to modify the work? Isn't there something that can be done? Ask the questions. Because in my view, if you ask the questions, everybody wants to help the child. Everybody's there to do the right thing. And hopefully you're going to get a good team that's going to do that. If for whatever reason there's a disagreement and you believe that your child should be getting something that's not offered, Rebecca touched on it. There's options, mediation, due process, but bring it to the table, talk about it. And I'll let somebody else comment because I know that Rebecca is also a big advocate for inclusion.
Right. Well, I agree 100% with what Mary Fran is saying, that the problem in New Jersey is that New Jersey is 49th in the country as far as including students with disabilities. So, it's something you have to push for. And the harder you push when the child is young, the more likely you are to be able to keep them in a less restrictive environment as they move up. So it's something, that it's important to really work on early on when your
Can I
child
add?
enters.
I just wanted to add something here, since we're talking about inclusion in the classroom. And we didn't really talk about out of district schools any. I'm not quite sure how to define an out of district school. So I'm going to do it in a non-legal way. They are schools that are set up throughout the state, and it's on the state website, and they provide schooling for kids who have special needs. I mean, I guess that's a pretty good definition. A lot of times your IEP team will recommend an out of district school for you. And as a parent, you have a right to accept that school or not accept that school. And you have a right to visit that school. As a parent, I have visited almost 20 out of district schools in the state of New Jersey. And I am here to tell you that as a parent, make sure you visit the school, make sure you spend the day there, make sure you walk around. Some of those out of district schools are absolutely horrible. I don't think I went into one that did not have, I want to say a rubber room. It's not really rubber. It's like a padded room where they put the kids in when they misbehave, or isolation room. So you have to be very, very careful about that. The other thing that you have to consider when the school decides that your kids should be out of district is what your kid's issue is and how they're classified. Because some places will classify ADHD as a behavioral problem, and then they will want to send your kid to an out of district school for kids with behavioral issues. That's not a good thing at all, because your kid will get to a school where he or she is surrounded by kids with serious behavioral issues, and all your kid has ADHD, and that can be a tragedy in the making. As a parent, you need to get hold of that and know exactly where your kid is going. Now, I think it was Mary, you said everyone's there to help you. Not necessarily. Maybe in some schools, yeah, but not necessarily. I have found that the people in the IEP team, that's usually like, I don't know, like a math teacher, English teacher, the school nurse, psychologist, whatever it is. It's a mix of people. They may not necessarily define helping your child the way you choose to help your child. And the other thing that has not been brought up, so I'll bring it up, is race. Now, when I was going through this in my district, I looked at the stats. I went on the Board of Ed website and they have all the stats of who's in public ed and who's in special ed and what grade and what race and what gender. It's all there. What I found for some districts is that most of the kids who are Black or Latino are classified as other and they're placed in special ed schools, which, you know, you got to be real, especially Black boys. So if you are a Latino parent or a Black parent, you have to be extra careful about how your child is being treated because they are quick to get classified. They're quick to get classified as other and then shipped off to the out of district school, which depending on the school could be the beginning.
Oh, Yvette, did we lose you for a minute?
Of the end of their education.
Mhm.
No, I'm still here.
Oh,
I'm
okay,
done.
Good. Go ahead, Rebecca.
What do you mean that by other? You mean other health impaired?
Yeah, like when you look at it, it just says other, right? Because like there could be a classification, yeah, other. They have an other category.
Oh,
Other health impaired, sometimes they use that, you know, I mean, I have clients that have ADHD that are other health impaired. You know, sometimes parents want that because they don't want like a learning disability. You know, Rebecca, I'm sure you have similar stories where, you know, because other health impaired could be, you know, someone who has an IEP for a limited purpose or, you know, so it really, I think it really, you know, depends about that. I know that some parents that I represent would rather have that than a specific learning disability or autism or, you know, whatever it is. But I think you might be referring to something different. I'm not sure, but that's just my understanding.
right. But the numbers do show exactly what Yvette is saying, that students of color are more likely to be wrongfully classified and or disciplined, which means that sometimes they are sent out of district, which can be, I mean, it is a problem. It is a problem.
Thank you for flagging that, Yvette. We can't talk about these issues in equity and not talk about race. So thank you so much. We are very close to time, and I want to thank everyone for hanging in there with us. I know it's a lot of rich content. I did want to give, for those who need CLE credit, the code. It is LB, as in little black, and then 8422. So LB 8422. So we have got just a few minutes left. I feel like, you know, there have been some really important themes here. It's never too early to start. You have to take responsibility for advocating for your child. No one's going to do that but you, like you're going to do it. We've talked a lot about resources. You know, we're going to provide certain things, but I've heard check the school website, check the state website, you know, look for these things and take advantage of them, ask questions, explore options. Lots and lots of great advice. I'd love to give each of our panelists just a minute for your final tips for parents, for caregivers who are going through this, who maybe suspect that their child needs services, or starting this process, or maybe feeling a little weary. You know, Yvette, you talked about how difficult and challenging this can be for even the most sophisticated parents. So I'd love to give you each a minute, and I'm going to start with you, Yvette. Your biggest tip, most important piece of advice.
So be prepared to be exhausted. It is a struggle. And, you know, you work, you have other kids, you have to make sure they get fed, but do not let the education thing slip, especially in the early years, because it can be almost impossible for your child to catch up and reach their true potential. So you have to stay on it.
That's great.
That's my advice.
Thanks. How about you, Rebecca?
I agree totally. I mean, it may seem in the beginning that it's overwhelming, but you take a step, you continue to move along. And the other thing is you try to develop some support along the way. Like when you go to IEP meetings, take a friend, take another parent, take a relative with you. SPAN also trains parents to go to IEP meetings with other parents. So that is an option. And those are all services that are free. And of course, you can also bring an advocate, you could bring an attorney, but going to a meeting with another parent who has similar concerns, maybe not the same concerns, maybe their child is very different, but they're there to support you. And when you sit across the table from 7 or 8 school personnel, no matter how nice they are. And most IEP meetings are, you know, done in a professional, you know, manner. But you're still outnumbered. So bringing someone else along that you can talk to before or after is very helpful so that you can continue making that push.
Mary Fran?
So I touched on this. I mean, the earlier the better, you know, and be your child's advocate. You know, I 100% agree that nobody cares for your child like you do. And so you should speak up. And then the other thing that we didn't talk about yet, but if it's not in the IEP, it doesn't exist.
Right.
So if there's something talked about at the IEP meeting or something's talked about in an email or on the phone, you can't rely on that service or whatever it is to be given to your child. Put everything in writing. And if you want a service or you want something and it was talked about, make sure it's in the IEP. So in my experience, I haven't seen many IEPs given right after the IEP meeting, but if that happens, don't sign it. Take a look at it, show it to somebody else, you know, make sure that everything's there. So I mean, I haven't seen it happen, you know, recently, but if it does happen, don't sign it and
Right.
just make sure that everything's there, because that's the biggest thing that I tell my clients. If it's not in the IEP, it doesn't exist.
Right.
I-
And you never,
Jump on that one.
This is important. Too often in every IEP meeting I've ever gone to, when I got there, they already had that IEP done and ready for me to sign right then and there. Do not let them do that to you, parents. Because that they will pull that on you in a heartbeat and say, but we're a team. But the team, except for you, came up with this IEP that they want you to sign as soon as you walk in the door. So no, you take that with you and you read it. And don't isolate yourself. Like, a lot of parents don't want to talk about the issues with their kids, but you will be surprised at how many parents have IEPs and 504s. And that's where I got so much information from, with other parents saying, did you do this? You can do that. I got a lawyer. So sometimes you're going to have to talk to other people and kind of let them in.
Yeah, and one other tip on that front with the IEP, some school districts will actually give parents like a draft IEP. They don't like to do that, but sometimes they will. But one thing you can ask for that they should give you are the present levels. So the teachers write in there what the present levels are. Ask for that from your child's case manager, because I find that those are super helpful when you go into the IEP meeting, because you have an idea already then what the teachers are going to say. And you could go through it. Sometimes it's in an IEP that my clients have received it, and sometimes it's in a Word document that the case manager will give to the parent. And I don't think a lot of people know that you can ask for that. So I think it's a really, like, you know, top secret tip here that you're getting from this program. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.
This has been amazing. So many tips, so much knowledge, and so much like palpable passion. All right. I mean, anybody who thinks you can't convey it via Zoom is not a part of this webinar, but it's been amazing. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for your candor, for your expertise, for your work, for your passion. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Essex County Legal Aid Association, Johnson & Johnson, the Essex County Bar Association, and the Garden State Bar Association. I'd like to thank Natalia Johnson and all the organizers, and thank all of you again for joining us. And remember, you're going to receive those resources. So be on the lookout and check the websites. And I hope everyone has a really great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.